I've said numerous times that one of the biggest frustrations in modern wrestling for me is that there are so many championship belts that, by their very nature, are meaningless. The WWE Universal Championship, for example, only exists to have a prop on the show that the WWE Championship isn't on. I also don't like that we have two sets of tag team championships and two women's championships either, which just dilute their importance, but I kind of get those ones. But there are championships that mean absolutely nothing. Although it's not just limited to now, it's certainly gotten worse. For example, the old WWF European Championship. You don't have to be European to win it, and it can be defended anywhere in the world, so what's European about it? Or the United States Championship. Granted, this is technically from the WCW days, but you don't have to be American to win it, nor is it only defended in America. There's literally nothing US about it, unlike the IWGP United States Heavyweight Championship, which at least tries to have an American-based stipulation to it. The reality is that the United States Championship was the WCW's number 2 championship. You have the World Championship, and then below that, the US Championship. Now that does somewhat make sense for a US-based promotion, but these days, it's not the number 2 championship anymore. Or it is, but it isn't. Because, you see, there's 2 number 1 belts, but one of them is arguably the lesser of the 2, depending on what mood WWE is in. And then there's 2 second-tier belts that are technically the same level, except the one that was coming from WCW is always going to be of lower importance. And then sometimes WWE bills the NXT champions as almost equal standing, so it's just a complete mess. Back when things were a little simpler, WCW had the US Championship as its number 2 belt, while the WWF had the Intercontinental Championship. But growing up, I never knew what Intercontinental meant. I mean, doesn't that just mean international or world? And when I started watching wrestling, the belt that was used at the time just looked like a smaller version of the world title, so why was it called that? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to the belt's inception in 1979, and it relies heavily on the fact that TV was much simpler, the internet didn't exist, and no one was releasing home video versions of wrestling content. It all starts with Ted DiBiase. Ted was one of the hotter stars of the late 70s, and after touring around a bit and winning titles everywhere he went, it soon became obvious that he was ready for bigger pushes. In early 1979, he signed with the WWF, and one of his signing bonuses was that he'd be awarded with the specially created WWF North American Championship. He didn't even have to win it, he'd just be handed it, which is a little hard to follow in kayfabe, but basically they said he was the North American champion, and when coming to the WWF, they recognised that championship and carried it over.
As everyone knows, I brought the North American Championship with me, and the Worldwide Wrestling Federation acknowledged that championship after I came here.
In June of 1979, Pat Patterson defeated DiBiase for the belt, but then in September of that year, he was suddenly feuding with him over the Intercontinental Championship. The story was that he travelled to Brazil for a tournament to merge the North American Championship with the South American Championship, with him being the representative for the North. He caused a major upset by winning that tournament, and the result of the merging of those 2 continents' championships became the Intercontinental Championship. Except there was no such thing as the South American Championship, and there was no tournament in Brazil either. There was no tournament at all, it was all made up. So, in other words, it's nonsense. Essentially it means the American Championship, or the Americas Championship. But if there was genuinely a South American Championship, and they were working a program where they were building up to this tournament in Brazil, where this was the big payoff, and then that leads to rematches and lasting feuds, all to sell tickets and draw money, then it makes complete sense. But none of it existed, none of it happened. Just one day, Pat Patterson was the North American champion, and then all of a sudden, in September of 1979, he was the Intercontinental champion. But the North American Championship still existed, because he dropped it to Seiji Sakaguchi 2 months later, so it wasn't even really unified. Technically speaking, he was simultaneously the North American champion and the Intercontinental champion, which itself could have been worked into an angle, except Sakaguchi never lost the belt, and it was never merged with the Intercontinental Championship either, it was just abandoned. The closest we'd see to it in the WWE again was when NXT revived the name, but that too has absolutely no meaning, because you don't have to be from North America to win it, nor is there a strict stipulation that it can only be defended in North America either. It's just a belt, something to use as a prop and to sell more replica merch. So the greater question is not, what does it mean, but more, why was this unified but not unified championship title created in the first place? Some thought it was because WWF went on to use stars like Pedro Morales to really appeal to a more Latino audience. And while Morales was from Puerto Rico, which is technically not South America, it seemed like a belt that was more representative of all of the Americas would work well for feuds between Morales and white North Americans. And there's no doubt that the feuds worked. There was a huge increase in Latino audiences for the WWF in the early 80s. Many of the early champions and contenders were either Latinos or so-called Islanders, like Tito Santana, who was Latino American, Don Morocco, who was from Hawaii, and Jimmy Snuka, who was technically Fijian but moved to Hawaii as a child. Again, none of these are from South America, but it does feel like they were going for more of an international feel to the championship. But the reality is, this might actually be an effect rather than the cause. You see, the WWF had just transitioned from being called the WWF, but they were still part of the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance. After introducing the North American Championship, Vince McMahon Sr. reportedly became aware of another North American Championship within the NWA in the Mid-South territory. While Vince McMahon Jr. probably wouldn't have cared less about this, McMahon Sr. respectfully decided to withdraw his new championship. Or so the story goes. In reality, WWF had actually got there first. The Mid-South North American Heavyweight Championship wasn't known as that until September 1979, which is the same month that the Intercontinental Championship was introduced, although it was spoken about in an interview in August of that year. So the Intercontinental Championship was supposedly meant to replace the WWF North American Championship because of the Mid-South's North American Championship, which didn't exist yet. I can only assume that it has something to do with the fact that while it was called the Tri-State Championship when Ted DiBiase was winning it, it had previously been the NWA North American Heavyweight Championship, or at least the Tri-State version of it. I don't know, it gets very complicated. But also, it was played off that McMahon was made aware of Mid-South's belt and respectfully changed the name of his belt, when in actual fact Ted DiBiase claimed on WWF television multiple times that he brought the title with him when he joined, even though he wasn't that champion at the time. He even claimed to have won the title from Fritz von Erich the year prior, but as far as I can tell, not only did that not happen, Fritz von Erich never won the Tri-State version of the North American Championship, only the Amarillo version, a belt that hadn't existed for 10 years, but I assume they wanted to allude to that because it had previously been won by both Pat Patterson and Ted's dad, Mike DiBiase. So the whole thing is just a kayfabe mess that you could get away with because of the different TV territories and the no internet, etc. Ted signing with the WWF was, in part, because he was being passed by the likes of Paul Orndorff and Ernie Ladd in the battle for the North American title. So by Vince McMahon swooping in and offering him the same title, no questions asked, he jumped ship to give his career a boost. They'd clearly annoyed some people by diminishing the importance of the other territories' belts, so came up with a way of actually making theirs more prestigious. The issue for WWF was, you can't just kill a title a few months after introducing it. As such, they came up with the story about Pat Patterson causing a major upset at this fictitious tournament in Brazil, and that was that. Although, it's a bit weird that they didn't just say that the belts had been unified and let it go. You still had the old belt transition to Sakaguchi, and it wasn't abandoned until 10 months after the Intercontinental Championship first appeared. Maybe this was something to do with a contractual thing where Sakaguchi was promised a title win and would hold it for a set amount of time. I have no idea. There doesn't seem to be any explanation for that anywhere. Sakaguchi is long retired, and sadly Pat Patterson is no longer with us, so we can't ask them. Ironically, after being the catalyst for the whole mess, DiBiase quickly left the WWF and went back to Mid-South Wrestling to become a 4-time North American Heavyweight Champion. So the thing was relatively unnecessary anyway. But the Intercontinental Championship ended up outdating all of their careers. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the Intercontinental Championship was considered the workhorse belt and was used to be the starting block for future champions. It's arguably one of the most iconic and important championships of all time, so it's such a shame that it's lost so much of its significance. Well, anyway, that's about it for this video, but before we wrap it up, let's see what Ted DiBiase himself remembers of those times. Ted?
Hey Matt, there's not a whole lot of story about me winning the North American Heavyweight title when I went to New York, the WWF as it was then in 1979. Reality is they brought me in as the North American Heavyweight Champion. Until that time, the WWF only had a world champion, world tag team champions, world ladies champion. They had no other titles other than those. So with me, they brought in and created their own North American Heavyweight Champion. And that's how I was introduced from the first day. And so that's the story. And then, of course, a little bit of time went by, and I just happened to mention to Vince Sr. that Cowboy Bill Watts in the Mid-South territory had his main champion called the North American Champion. And when he found that out, then that's how they came up with the storyline. And basically, what they said, because I dropped the North American Championship to Pat Patterson, and then they made up a story that Pat went off to a tournament somewhere in, like I think they said, Rio de Janeiro, and all these champions put up their titles, and whoever won the title, whoever won that contest for all those championships would come out of that championship battle as the Intercontinental Champion. And that's how the Intercontinental Champion came into existence. So there's a story. I hope you like it. One more thing, Matt, before I go. Always remember this. Everybody's got a price for the $1 Million Man.